Yes, I sent her the video. She wishes she was here. Fine, thank you.
Where do I sit, Katie? Yeah. I think you should just do whatever you feel.
You're the organising committee.
Oh yeah, you gotta start.
Okay, I think we'll get started. It's a bit of a walk from coffee, I know, but we need to keep on schedule. So if you could take your seats. Okay, hello, bonjour. I'm Katie Hill. I work for the Global Ocean Observing System and the Global Climate Observing System, and I'm based at the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. I'll introduce our panelists here. We have Tosta Tanhua, who's co-chair of the Global Ocean Observing System, and he's a senior scientist at Guiomar in Germany. Patricia Miloslavich, who's the project officer for the Goose Biology and Ecosystems panel based at the University of Tasmania, and she's also a senior professor at the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Simón Bolívar in Venezuela. Dick Schaap, who's managing director of the Maris company in the Netherlands, and also the technical coordinator of the Pan-European Sea Data Net, marine data management infrastructure, and he's involved in many other data-related initiatives. And Kane Tayapa, who's general manager of Manaki Te Awanui Charitable Trust in New Zealand. So we've got a nice, diverse panel. If we could, yes, bring the slides up. I don't think I've got a clicker. Oh, it's here. Sorry, I've got it. Okay, so just in terms of some scene setting, I've got a couple of slides. And we've talked about how we've got to here a number of times, but it's worth remembering in the context of interoperability and governance. And really these big global experiments of the 80s and 90s, the World Ocean Circulation Experiment, the Tropical Ocean Global Atmosphere Experiment, and the Joint Global Ocean Fluxes experiment, were these big global efforts which brought the community together, set the foundations both scientifically and also in terms of bringing the community together to enable us to talk about how we then would go forward and implement an observing system in sustained mode. OceanObs 99 really then set the design for a sustained observing system largely focused on the needs of climate and then expanding more into shorter term requirements. And OceanObs 09 opened the doors to the broader uses and led to the development of the framework for ocean observing. And I think those doors have been blown wide open in terms of uses and users at OceanObs 19. So going forwards, given the momentum to date and the increasing complexity of what we're trying to implement, we're trying to implement an integrated, multi-platform, multidisciplinary, multi-scale, multi-use, and user-driven observing system. And really an observing system that's interoperable. So I'm considering interoperability in its broadest sense. It's often used from just a data point of view. And we need the governance in place to enable the funding, development, implementation, use, and evaluation of that system. So how do we ensure that we develop an interoperable observing system to meet those needs? A governance framework that's interoperable, i.e. all organizations and constructs and organizational cultures can see how they engage. We need interoperable practices and methods and interoperable data and information. In other words, we want equity and transparency in the participation, access, use, and benefit of the observing system. So I'll move forward and introduce Tosta Tanhua. And Tosta will, so Tosta Goose has recently developed an ambitious new strategy for the program. And what will we need to implement in terms of principles that we'll need to follow in terms of governance to realize this strategy?
So thank you, Katie. I think if you give me the first slide, since we heard it many times, since the last OceanObs, we developed the FOO, the framework of ocean observing. It's been fundamental for the community the last 10 years. It created a system of, well, it gave us a system engineering approach to sustained and ocean observations. It gave us a common language. It gave us the readiness concept. It gave us the EUVs. It also promoted fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data systems. And it had promoted capacity building and advocacy. So I think we did a lot of successes by the FOO process that has been implemented the last 10 years. And we've seen a big pull from society for information. This one. So Goose published the 2030 strategy just a few months ago. This is a vision for a broader ocean observing community to create the partnership needed for deliver the information needed for a wide range of stakeholders and partners. To make this happen, we need to make a step change in the level of effectiveness and partnerships across the value chain of ocean observing. So GOOS is looking at delivery on 3 societal benefit areas centered around climate, operational services, and ocean health. And since Ocean Ops 09, the system has grown much more complex. We have a much broader community. We have a much bigger pool from stakeholders. We have more partners. We have more processes to monitor. We have more EUVs. We have EUVs. In summary, it's a much more complex system. To manage this system, we need interoperability among a wide range of partners. So we need interoperability for requirement settings across the society benefit areas. It's not enough anymore to go out and make observations only for climate. You should consider if you can make observations to support operational services and ocean health with your network. We need interoperability across platforms and networks. We need interoperability in the data management systems. We need to be able to build our data products that we need from a wide range of data providers and platforms. And we need interoperability around information delivery. So we have a much more complex system. So we need an effective and efficient governance system to operate this and to govern this system. So how do we govern and how do we foster efficient cooperation between partners? How do we have a governance system that increases interoperability between the components I just mentioned? How do we create a governance system that supports an adaptive feedback loop on our observing system to assess if our system is delivering the information needed by the requirement settings? How do we have a governance system that can suggest changes to the ocean observing system to increase the effectiveness and create synergies and make it more cost efficient? In the lower part, you see the left side is the structure of how the governance system is organized today in the GOOS community. To the right is a potential future scenario on how you can organize the governance. Particularly, we see a panel for delivering on societal benefit areas that leads through the panels on physics, chemistry, and ecosystem biology down to the EUVs. We're going to have many more networks to respond to EUVs in biology, biogeochemistry, and new physical variables. So how do we manage these networks? How do we make them interoperable? What kind of governance system do we need? So I think that after 10 years in developing the FOO, we need to take the FOO and GOOS into the service to grease it up, tune it up, and refurbish some of the parts to create that governance system for the increased interoperability. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tosta. If you could pass the clicker down to Patricia. So, Patricia, so you've played a lead role in the Sensors of Marine Life and then the development of the biological component of GOOS. How has the framework for ocean observing helped develop the biological EOVs, and what do you think is needed in the context of governance and interoperability to take sustained biological ocean observing forward?
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Katie. I'll just pass to the previous one. Yeah. So thanks for that question. And yes, I did help build the Global Ocean Observing System for the Biology and Ecosystem Panel, and we definitely, the framework for ocean observing was definitely a pillar in our doing. So we just heard from Toste talking about the framework and what it needs to, the 10 years of experience in the past and how we will move into the future, and definitely he talked a lot about interoperability and governance. So as one of the things that we need to embrace from the framework for ocean observing is that it is focused on essential ocean variables that are based on the relevance for societal issues, but also on their technical and scientific feasibility. So when we talk about interoperability, what is actually needed? For interoperability to work, the system is made of many networks, and we have to respect and embrace that because that diversity is good. But one of the things that need to have a common standard is that these networks that compose the observing system to measure actually these EOVs and report of them have a mission that is fit for purpose, addressing science, policy, and management needs. They also need to have a spatial scale that addresses local and national needs, but as a group, they contribute to global reporting also on relevant indicators for the SDGs and other targets. They need to be sustainable. We heard this morning, the trends need to be learned over time, so repeatability is fundamental. Also, they need to engage on best practices using globally accepted standards, new technologies, standard operating procedures, all the way from data collection all the way to the product. So data management will be fundamental. To have fair and open data standards, we've heard about these on the last days. It's really important that people are allowed to know the attribution and provenance. We heard from our Ghana colleague this morning that what they envision in the next years is basically to have the awareness of where is information and where for what you can use it. Have that open data, have that metadata as we have today on JCOM for the physical variables will be critical. To support interoperability, the data aggregation and reuse. And finally, nothing of this happens alone. We all need to have capacity development and technology transfer to support the extension of these standard operating procedures to support these local and regional needs. And all of these attributes need to be progress. So we need to monitor our own progress in these to achieve these and report them at the highest level. So finally, for governance, I just want to put an example. And these are 5 nice pictures or 5 very different ecosystems. A mangrove forest, a seagrass bed, a coral reef, a seamount, a rocky shore, and the last one is a seamount. All of them have, their own unique biodiversity. They all have physical, biogeochemical environment associated. They're all unique because they are made of diverse organisms, each of them with a function. Without these organisms performing that function, the ecosystem would not exist as such. But there's one thing that they all need. They are unique, they work, they fulfill a role, and they are quite efficient, but they all need a basic thing. They all need a source of energy. Without that source of energy, which is our sun, they would not work. And also they need a foundation, which is the water in which they live. So each one can learn much about this because despite they are unique, they all have something in common, which is that energy source. And that energy source, if we can learn from that and translate it into governance, that's the leadership we want. No network and no system is going to work if you don't have clear leadership, if we don't have champions. And those champions need to forward everything from, have the connections, have the drive, and have all the vision to move forward and the time and the commitment to move forward those that governments and the system. They also need to have a common foundation. In our case, we have that. That's the framework. Let's embrace it. We also need to have strong partnerships and collaboration across all of the stakeholders. There are producers of information, there are consumers of information, and we are all in the same boat because we all need that. And then finally, as this is telling us, we just use the model that works best to achieve the network attributes. Those network attributes that I showed in the previous slide is what we need to achieve, but how to achieve them, it will vary from one or other system. But we, at the end, they all need to report back at the highest level. So that's what I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patricia. So next we have Dick Sharp. And Patricia has mentioned the FAIR principles of data management. Where do we need to focus effort to improve the interoperability of data, and what needs to change, do you think, in terms of governance to support this?
Katie, thank you. I want to start, first of all, I am very active in the European data management, let's say marine data management, for more than 30 years. And also I've been involved in developing many European infrastructures over time, which have come to age. And I would like to show you a couple of items from there and then use that as a way to come to interoperability and what we need to do. First of all, if you look in Europe, which I'm most familiar with, let's say we are collecting a lot of data, and we have done a study a few years ago, and then we found out that data is being collected by more than 1,000 organizations. And of course, they are governments, they are research institutes, and they are also private industry. And if you look at the domains, it's all of the different domains, which you also expect, of course. Most is in physics, but there's also a lot in geophysics and meteorology, chemistry, biology, geology, bathymetry. And overall, I say there was an assessment made of the costs involved, and it was about 1.4 billion euro a year, which is 1 billion for in situ and 0.4 for the satellite programs, especially the Sentinel, the Copernicus program. And if you look at those numbers, of course, you say, oh, then it's really worthwhile, or is necessary that we do something about the data management, because data management is quite instrumental in bringing the data collection and the user applications or the products together, or let's say in interaction. And I agree with an earlier remark that there is, of course, a circle around this, that the applications, they influence the availability and the requirements for the data collection, and the other way around. So there's quite a circle with an uptake. And also there's a technological innovation also taking part, both at the collection level, but also at the data management level. So one of my statements is that you need professional data management by professional people who have a daily job in doing data management, to bring, let's say, the collected data and the applications and the users together, because that's really needed. And that means that you build on standardization, you build on quality control, you build on protocols, you build on long-term archiving. And of course you have to also look at the F and the I, let's say the findable and accessible in the FAIR definition. One of the mottos we are using in Europe is measure once and use multiple times. And that sounds very simple, but it's enormously difficult. Especially if you look at FAIR. FAIR says findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And for me, the reusable is the one that determines the multiple time use. And that's the most difficult one. It's not interoperable. Interoperable is, in fact, you can overcome. At least it depends a little bit at what level you look at it, but you can overcome it. And I will show you. But first of all, I want to show you some of the, let's say, the overarching infrastructures that we have in Europe, which are focusing on marine data and data products. First of all, there's CDataNet, and CDataNet is a bottom-up approach. It started in the end of the 90s, and we brought together the national oceanographic data centers to make a network and started sharing data, making them available for exchanging by discovery and access. And over time, this system has, with support from the European Commission, the RTD program, and of course with national support, because every center is based on national funding, we have built up now an infrastructure with more than 110 data centers in all the different disciplines connected. And you have discovery and access to all this data. Like I say, it's a bottom-up approach. Then in 2008, there was a top-down approach initiated by DG Mare, another EU directorate. And they said, we want to have an overarching network, we call it EMODNet, European Marine Observation and Data Network. We were lucky in our discussions and lobby, let's say, to make sure that they didn't reinvent the wheel, but that they made use of the CDataNet network to have immediate, let's say, momentum, and then to focus more on, let's say, more parties adopting the same principles, the standards and the protocols, And this way we were able to in fact, to expand the CDataNet from 40 to 110 data centers under the influence of this AWNet. And then in AWNet, more and more focus on generic products. So making products that really matter to European society. And at the same time, not to be in competition, of course, with the open market, because you have to be very careful if you make too specific products. And in fact, because what we found out, and everybody knows, I think, in this room, that a lot of people talk about data requirements, but in practice, they are interested in data products. They want to see analysis, they want to see products. But to be able to make those products, you need, of course, the data. So there's the, let's say, the interrelation that is feeding this. But okay, AWNet works fine. AWNet is organized in thematics. So we have for each discipline, we have another thematic group of interested parties. And they work with the common principles by CDataNet, but also by Eurobis, let's say for the biological biodiversity elements. And also with ECDI, what we call the geological data infrastructure in Europe. And this way we make very nice products, and we see an increasing number of downloads and users who are interested in those products. And in those products, we immediately do the tracing and tracking. So we make available the information about which data providers, which originators were involved in that product. Because that's something about acknowledgement. It's not only scientific acknowledgement, but also, let's say, simply the provision, the justification to our governmental organizations who are funding a lot of monitoring. Another program in Europe is the Copernicus, the Marine Environmental Monitoring Service. That's, let's say, more or less funded by DG GROW, and it's related to the Sentinel, the Copernicus program, the satellite program. And you could say it was set up originally, or is still, to develop applications based upon the satellite program. And what they do is they develop and provide marine environmental forecast products. But next to this, they also developed INSTAC, the in situ TAC, to bring together a lot of operational oceanography data, not only from Europe, but from the whole world, because they needed to feed that to the models. And also Copernicus is very successful in its products and has also an increasing user base. And of course, there are more and more requirements, and they are moving more and more now also to not only physics, but also to the biogeochemistry domain, which requires new ecosystem approach and new input. And then we have EuroGOOS, which is the European component of GOOS, and you could say that's a network of all the monitoring agencies in Europe who are having sustained monitoring, and they get together and they give also access to all their operational observations. There are relations between these systems. I don't want to go in much detail, but what we try to do is that we, all these infrastructures, and there are more, they are working together. And what they share is more and more adopting common standards. And the standards are not only in technology, let's say ISO, W3C, or OTC, but also, let's say, syntax standards, so formats, and more also the semantics, which means the controlled vocabularies. And that's really necessary to be able to speak to each other and to have interoperability, and also to have a mutual understanding, because we're going more and more to machine processes, and they can only work if the coding is understood between the machines. So what I want to say is that the commonality, how we try to solve this interoperability and this reusability, is that we work on those common standards, and CDataNet is one of the leading parties developing standards, but they're being adopted and adapted by the others. And the others, of course, give feedback by which we can enrich those standards. Because we see also all the time new instruments coming in, like HF radar, like other types, let's say, that require new vocabularies or new approaches to our data formats to be able to sustain the whole operation. And if we look then at fairness, let's say fairness is, like I said, the findable and accessible is covered, very well covered. Interoperable is also well covered, because we use those common vocabularies and we can convert between different formats. We also did a global exercise. We worked in the ODIP project, Ocean Data Interoperability Platform, together with the US and together with let's say, with Australia for 6 years. And in there we compared our differences and we looked for commonalities. And it was very successful in the sense that we had not so much differences, but we have common goals. And those common goals, we could develop some prototypes which then were very successful for all parties. But to come now to the last word, the R, because for me the R is the most difficult one, and that's the reusable. And what we see is that we have more and more users, but those users, if you really want to have measure once and use many times, those users have specific, they have different requirements. And that means they want richer and richer metadata. And they want to see the quality control you have applied. They want to see the calibration. They want to see the method that you have applied in the laboratory. And that's something that, if we look at our legacy databases, that information is not always available. But of course, we can, let's say, project forward that we make it available in the near future. And for that purpose, it's very necessary that we start working more and more on enriching the metadata in the field during the collection. And that could be done for automatic systems by adopting sensor web enablement standards. And it could be done for sampling and other, let's say, human interfacing, done by researchers enriching the metadata to a higher level, of course in a standardized way, again using vocabularies, using the ocean best practices, to be able to have a product or have data descriptions which can be reused for many, many purposes, and then in a substantial way, and not only, let's say, as a byproduct. Okay.
Thank you, Dick. So before we move to our next speaker, I'll encourage you, please, to post some questions in the Slido. One of our colleagues over here, Billy Kessler, in the bright shirt, has written a bit of a manifesto on the Slido. I encourage you to tackle him at lunch and over a beer this afternoon if you'd like to discuss his manifesto. But we're really looking for questions for our panelists. If possible, please. Thank you. So moving on to our fourth and final speaker. So Kane, in the context of governance and interoperability, this certainly has a human element. And we need to foster diverse participation, both in terms of organizations, communities, and individuals in how we develop and use ocean information. There are communities around the world that live strongly connected to the environment, and how do we ensure that this community knowledge and experience is an integrated component of our ocean observing and monitoring efforts? So over to you.
Yeah, kia ora. E te tuatahi ka mi ki o mātou I tēnei wā. E te whare e tū nei I mi kawana mai, e papa e tākoto wana, mi kawana mai a rātou. Huri no he mi a tana atua, nei te hunga mate o nā atua mō tēnei whenua, nā tangata pito o tēnei whenua, ka mihi kawana ki a mātou. I just want to acknowledge the indigenous people of this land. I'm thankful for being on your whenua, on your land. Also want to acknowledge your ancestors, and your ancestors are my ancestors, so thank you. Kia ora, my name's Kane Taiapa. What you see here in the slide, I guess, is an introduction to one of my ancestors. His name is Mowo. It's the mountain sitting in the foreground there. Next to Mowo is our moana, Te Aonui, and it's been the life sustenance of our people. In terms of governance, these two iconic features within our lands have governed our people for the last millennia. They've created our language, our protocols, and our customs. The key thing for us is to carry on those traditions. And the big task, I guess, is always how do we do that? Our people have been fortunate to have leaders who foreseen, I guess, the loss of our lands, but also creating the space for us to keep those traditions. What you see here is a wharenui with one of the hapu in Tauranga Moana. There's 28 hapu spanning across about 32k coastal space. Each have their own autonomy, each have their own governance, and each have been a perspective personified from the environment that they've lived in. The key thing for these whares too is that this is where all our traditional knowledge is stored. For us at Manaki Te Aonui, our MO is pretty simple. We live in a space where there's two sets of knowledge in New Zealand. There's obviously policy and legislation that has created obstacles for our people, but there's also our own traditions. And what we've been trying to do is how do we reclaim our traditions in terms of looking after the environment, acknowledging our place in the environment and promoting those things across the legislation table. So for us, our main goal in Manaki Te Aonui is to increase our capacity in the house of our tangata whenua and bring that into a meeting place where we have government agencies and the like to discuss policy and legislation, and that's where our treaty co-management space has been developed. I think there's an assumption with a lot of people or science or whatever it may be that Indigenous people are intimate with their knowledge, and it's true. It is, but it's probably to a selected few. We've been going through a treaty process that began in 1840. For my iwi, it's just come to a final decision in 2012. Through that barrage, a loss of our knowledge was undertaken, and so the last 20 years we've been in a process where we collect that knowledge and store it. And when we collect that knowledge and store it, our key MOs in that space is how do we disseminate that information internally to those hapu that belong to that information, and then how do we disseminate that to the decision table when we're making decisions for our environment. And we usually house those in this, what we call a pātaka kōrero. And because of the digital space that we're in these days, our people are more accustomed to that space because it's easy to share and easy to get people on board. Aroha mai, I had another slide on there which was basically a picture of our process that we went through in 2012. It's quite unique because the slide showed our three iwi together, which is not an easy thing to do. The last time we come together was in 1865 to fight the Crown. In 2012, when we settled our treaty grievance, was the next time we come together. I think what it does uphold is that, you know, the traditions of looking after our whenua is our bottom line. When the Crown asked us, you know, what are we going to do to negotiate the environment that you're situated in, our bottom line was co-management, co-governance. And for that we had to look at across the 28 hapu, across the three nations, the three tribal nations, what would that look like from the ground up? The key thing for us is that our capability over that time and the foresight from our leaders, whom have all passed away, but had the foresight to build our capability in the sciences, in the legal system, accounting system, and whatever it may be, to make sure that our iwi are put forward first to look after the environment. And so in terms of where that information goes, as I mentioned before, it's housed in our pātaka and shared. The key thing for us to do that, though, is that even though as the precedents that we set for Manaaki Te Awanui is how we engage with those people. And engagement's the key part in all this discussion with us. We don't do things properly in terms of engagement, then we never get anything over the line. And if we want to introduce other forms of Indigenous groups into this space, engagement is always the key factor. Kia ora.
So yes, please continue to put some questions in for our panelists. I will humour Billy with the start of his manifesto. And I think it's related to a lot of what we're discussing here. He says good observers are not necessarily good at communicating useful information to non-specialist users. It's a different skill, and we need an intermediary. And related to that, and there's a number of points below that, but related to that is a question, I think, down further from Toshio Suga, and this is something that perhaps Tosta can respond to. He said, should we clearly distinguish between the inner feedback loop and the outer one in the framework for ocean observing diagram? And the ocean observing community could work in the former, and we need broader engagement in the latter.
Okay, Katie, I think the questions are clearly related. I think Billy is right. There is a need to have different set of skills, and some of us are really good at communicating, but many are not. And I think we need to reach out to these communities there know how to communicate. I think it's a high return on investment to do that. And I think it's necessary to justify the amount of money we spend on the ocean observing system, to communicate what we do, why we do it, and the results, the products. And I think the inner and outer loop of the feedback system relates to the data and data products versus the information that goes back to the requirements. And we have a gap in an information system. We have some components of a good information system, assessments like IPCC and IPBES and others. And we have some forecast systems that are operating in some parts of the world. But we have a big gap in that bigger picture global ocean observing system is to communicate the information that is useful for the end user. So I think that is something that we need to move on and improve the next decade.
Thank you, Tosta. Any other comments on those 2 points or questions?
Yeah, and I can relate to that. You know, we've been in a space of the conference talking about white papers and how we communicate that. And it's just like my opening introduction. I could probably count on one hand how many people understood what I said. And it's the same when our whānau read white papers. It doesn't mean anything to them. I think the clear thing is how we communicate science, especially for uptake, and how we make it relevant to look after the same goal, because we do have the same goals. The key thing though is how do we communicate what we're finding, and how do we make that usable in the terms of what we're enhancing.
Okay, and I guess in many ways the intermediaries can be what we consider some of the super users, right? Such as the Copernicus Marine Service and others. And I would ask Dick, how do you see our interaction with super users to make sure that we're delivering data that's fit for purpose for those needs, and they're then reaching out to the broader community of users?
Yeah. Now, first of all, I think that people that are collecting data, of course, when they want to really have others make use of it, they should make a data management plan. Let's say that's the first thing. And data management plan means that you cooperate together in a dialogue with those who are experts in data management and those who are experts in the collecting. And that also includes then the loop, let's say, with the users, the super users or even the smaller users, because they have specific requirements. And they can explain what they really expect and also what they want to do. And based on this, you can fine-tune the data management plan and then put it in place. And if you put it in place, then really make use of those existing infrastructures and also those existing expert data centers. But don't start your own thing, because otherwise it's a waste of your effort, in fact. It stays too local. And in that sense, we have quite a cooperation now also, let's say, between CDATRAT and Copernicus. And we're working, for instance, together on climatologies and big products, let's say climatologies, where there's always new data. And also we're working together on the quality control of those, because you have now, let's say, new technologies coming forward, like artificial intelligence, data mining, etc. And those things are really, we are testing those out together, because it's a technology that we both have to master, and it's better if we do it in synergy, because we have different projects, different funding, but bringing it together gives you more, 1 + 1 = 2.5. And in that way, I say, we get more and more also involved, or now you can say aware of each other's problems or each other's requirements. And that you have a structured dialogue, I would say, that's what you need. Okay?
Thank you. So switching gears a little, there's a question around the biological data. So interoperable for biological data also means a common taxonomy, which has not been mentioned so far. Will the decade put a focus on this important basis?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I didn't go into much detail about the taxonomy, but definitely it is an issue. We've heard all these days the eDNA as a tool that will change the way we looked at things in the next coming decade. And it's possible it will happen. But still, when we define the essential ocean variables, one of the things that we thought is that, well, we need to have, we cannot measure everything, but we don't need to measure anything also. So we went into essential ocean variables that were relatively easy and have a commonality across the globe to be able to measure. So For example, for some ecosystems, we have seagrasses, mangroves, coral reefs, and macroalgae forests. And for them, the common denominator is to know cover and composition. This will tell us a lot. We heard throughout this week, it's not the same to address scientific questions than to address monitoring needs. So the taxonomy is important to get those right, at least the cover and the composition of those essential ocean variables. But in the future, eDNA will help quite much on that. And we're already also engaging in techniques, visuals, imagery, and acoustics that will help also at least discriminate in functional groups. And that is also key to look at trends. It's the changes in the function of the system more than who is actually doing that will be most important.
Thank you, Patricia. So there's, I think, an increasing demand for ocean information for operational systems and the next generation forecast systems. And that is going to exercise our observing system and our data systems in new ways. And I saw there was a question, they keep moving around, from John Sidorn, who said, you know, FAIR is obviously key, but he worries about that we miss the timeliness element that underpins many services. And should FAIR be updated to FAIRT? Sounds Scottish. Dick, would you like to address that one?
Yeah, partly I already covered it, say the fairness. But like I say, fairness starts at the bottom of the pyramid. That means that those who collect already have to be aware of that they have to provide enough metadata about the process. And when they're doing it, it should be easy because they are supported by, let's say, instruments, by automated instruments, but also they are doing the thing on the job and they are able then to describe what they're doing. And I know it's not many people like it. Let's say, especially scientists don't like to describe too much when they're doing it because they want to go working with the data itself. But if you really want to make your data fair, let's say you must start at the bottom and take some effort. Use those common standards that we are providing, using the common vocabularies that we are providing. Help us to populate those vocabularies, make them larger, make them more fit for your purpose. If you have new parameters or new types of instruments or whatever you're using. And this way, we build up from the pyramid, let's say from the bottom, we build up the data stream, also supported by automated systems. And then you can later at the data archiving, the long-term stewardship, let's say, level, you can better use that data for multiple purposes. And that's for me one of my mottos, that I start at the originator and not try to do it from the other end, because then you will miss a lot of information. And that means that your data is then only fit for a few purposes instead of for multi-purpose.
Timeliness of data submission and making the data available on a short time is going to be a paradigm shift the next decade. It comes together with development of sensors. I come from biogeochemistry. We have a few biogeochemical sensors now that allows us to have near real-time data of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrate and other variables that we did not have 10 years ago. And we also see the user pull to have this data available on a real short time scale from different operational services for aquaculture, fisheries, and ocean health in general. So that is something, I kind of like to put that T in the end of FAIR, appropriate timescales. We have seen already now the last 10 years how data are getting more accessible. More scientists are actually making the data publicly available, much more, which is good, but we need to work on the timeliness, and we need to define what the latency should be for this data set. We have to put that in the requirement setting.
Patricia?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this data issue because as a biologist, we see that the physical community has been organized and sharing data for a long time. Biochemistry, relatively recent, but for biology, it's still, it's taking a little bit of more time. And there are two issues about that, around that. One is that our data is not available as ready and as quickly as physical data. It takes time, processing takes time, especially when you go through taxonomical issues. But as we have been developing implementation plans for the essential ocean variables, biological essential ocean variables in the last 2 years, One thing that's common, we've done this for the plankton, for the macroalgae, for the seagrass, for the mangrove, for the corals. One thing that comes across is now this new way of thinking. Biologists are rethinking their way of doing things, and they're more willing to share data. And this started very recently through the creation of the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, which was one of the end products of the Census of Marine Life. That's when people started to see the power of collaborating and putting their data on a common format that everybody could use, and they started to see the power of maps, and everybody went to see their data on that map, and if it was not, they would go and send it. So that was a really great beginning, and always has grown now to, I don't know, more than 50 million records on biodiversity, which is still not enough because it needs more capabilities now to include data that comes from DNA, from genomics, from visuals, from acoustics.
Okay, Billy, I assume this is a question, yes?
This is a question, totally different question about governance, and it concerns the TPOS 2020 project that's rethinking the observing system in the tropical Pacific. And we are facing all the issues that Dick talked about, the quality control, common standards, data distribution, all of those things. And I have to say I was really jealous because the Pacific is not Europe. And we have a common project with broad common objectives, but very difficult relations among the countries. And I think if you think around the Pacific Rim, we'll all see where that's happening. So the question is, how do we, in that situation where we have agencies that barely can have a telecon with each other, how do we use the international structure to produce a governance that is credible among all these nations and that will let us do the kind of things that you're doing in Europe?
Who'd like to tackle that?
I can make a try there, Bill. It's a difficult question, and I think there is a reason for Goose to be sitting in the intergovernmental room at United Nations, IOC, WMO, where this conversation can happen in a much more structured way. I think that is a good way of creating these synergies. But I think we can think in terms of science diplomacy, common objectives, common goals, working in a common framework with a similar language for what we want to achieve can facilitate this kind of communication between countries. I mean, it's very interesting for the experience from TPOS and try to apply that on a global scale. And I think we should have a conversation on how that can happen. Because it's really when you start to implement a project like the TPOS that you see how that can impede the conversation and the progress. But I think again that having meetings like this or having meeting in the governmental level can be very important.
Any other comments before we move on to another question from the floor? No? Okay.
Kia ora koutou, kia ora Kane, ngā mihi nui ki a koe. I was wondering if you had some ideas and perspectives of how the knowledge that you and your hapu and your iwi store in your pātaka, how that you can share that with the international community, and how the international community through the data systems that we've been hearing about in the FAIR process can then feed international type of data into the pātaka that you are holding at hapu level.
I guess the key thing with all Indigenous knowledge, they have been through a process of reclaiming and reframing. And we also got to be mindful too that in most cases, and I can identify a lot in New Zealand, is that all those hapu and iwi have is their knowledge. They've lost their land, they've lost the right to stewardship over their environment, and giving away information seems to be a very hard thing for them to do. So the first instance in how we tackle that or manage it is to engage with these people to enhance what they already know. And if we enhance what they already know, we're going through a process where engagement is solidifying the key fundamentals of what they're driving to or their aspirations. And i.e. their knowledge is leading the transfer and dissemination, and the science is assisting that. I think the other spectrum of that, or the other end of the scale, is that a lot of the hapu are further ahead than others in terms of how that knowledge is intimate with them. And it's not until they get into that space where they identify a way to disseminate that. And that dissemination phase, as I mentioned earlier, is multi-pronged. It's initially internally, where the whole hapu or tribe get on the same page of what that information means. And then they figure out a way to disseminate that through tools and science. And that seems to be the only way that's worked for us, that dissemination of using science to communicate to legislation and policymakers of traditional knowledge around the awareness of the environment. Hope that answered that question.
Thank you. So we are kind of running out of time here, but I'm going to ask a bigger question, and we've got Susan Weifel sitting here and standing here, and it might be something related to what she might be saying. But Eugene Berger says that Dick's slide showing the cost of in situ data that we take was very enlightening, and it emphasizes the importance to extract maximum value from that data. And he'd be interested in thoughts from the panel. And just with Susan standing there, Argo was one of the first programs to say, right, 10% of the investment in Argo needs to go on the management and curation of that data. And do we need to be pushing harder on that part of the envelope? So thoughts from the panel.
Yeah. I think in Europe, I'll say, well, of course, we have the European Commission, so it means that the member states are united in a commission. Although some want to step out, but we know of that. But what you see is that you have quite some ground floor, let's say, for these economic discussions. So it means that if you make this equation and you show it a couple of times, then people are very willing, let's say, to fund solutions to make it happen. And it's a well-organized network, of course, as a European Commission. So I can't speak on the global scale in that sense. It's not a very good... And if we look at USA, I think you have the same situation. But of course, there are many parts of the world where you are not so well organized, and it's very difficult to get this common thought together and have this economic discussion.
Any other thoughts?
So by not investing those 10% in data management, you risk of losing 90% of the value of your project.
Yeah. That's a simple equation.
I just want to add very quickly, because, well, I worked in South America for 25 years at Universidad Simón Bolívar, and I'm still associated with it. It's very different, because in those areas of the world, when you get the funding to do a project, it's usually to get the data. But it's the failure then, it's how to get the data into the cloud, to get it up there, that it's available. It's just very, very recently that the projects that we're obtaining funds for to collect new data are actually supporting as well, and making sure that the data goes to the public data sets.
Okay, Susan, we give you the final word, the final question for the panel.
Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is a session about governance, and I guess, this sounds very echoey, I guess the challenge I see ahead is, especially for the global networks, our observing system was designed for a fairly narrow user group, right? Climate researchers, forecasting systems, strong connections to WMO. We are now talking about many more sectors that we want to serve. And governance is critical to the requirement setting. And what I would like to see that comes out of this and happens through the UN Decade of the Ocean is a very deliberate and well-designed process to go sector by sector, engage with those sectors and help set priorities and requirements, because then we can respond and build a fit-for-purpose observing system. And asking, I mean, we all do outreach, all the folks working in research and running the networks do outreach and engage, but we cannot do this job. This is beyond us. We need serious process, not at the very highest level of government, but in between. Many of our partner service producers will be part of that discussion. But until we have that and the requirements are set, I don't know where we are. We're not following the food, that's for sure. So I just hope that out of this conference, we can kick off a process to deliberately set requirements and help guide us adapt the observing system.
So any final comments from the panel on that? Or do you want to case it in your wrap-up statements?
Acoustic was difficult, but I think what we need to do, and if I got the gist of the question, is that the interoperability and the trade space between different networks that were originally set up for a few specific questions needs to be organized on a more centralized level to see where you can get synergies between networks and where you maybe have redundancies. It's easy championing a network that you are engaged in to make sure that you can reach your own goals that you set up for that particular network. But looking at the framework and requirement settings, the need to understand a particular phenomena and the need to engage in observing particular EUVs to reach that goal, then you create this trade space for negotiating between different observing networks. And I'm not sure, Susan, if that was capturing the question completely, but maybe we have a discussion over lunch then.
Okay, so we're running out of time here, so just one final short statement from each of the panel on if there was one thing that you would change as we go forward into the next decade in terms of governance and interoperability, what would it be? Quick statement from each. Tosta, you start.
I hope when we sit here in 10 years, we have a bigger range of stakeholders engaged in this discussion.
I hope and I think that within 10 years there will be much more data available, let's say, in the cloud, and there will also be much more ability for everybody, let's say, to use those data with algorithms in virtual research environments, etc. Simply working with the data and getting more products out. And the thing is, when you develop more products, you also know better what kind of data you need, and there's this interaction, which means that then also the collectors of data are more stimulated to bring in the right data and the right metadata.
Where I'm from, we have a word called kotahitanga, which means unity, or working as one. I'd like to see how we do that. I'd like to also acknowledge how we uptake information, being mindful that there's many forms of knowledge, and being respectful of that knowledge is key to unity. Kia ora.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I hope that in the next decade we can truly commit it to multidisciplinarity. Ocean observers keep saying that they do observations for the benefit of the people, for the benefit of life on the ocean, of the ecosystems, but there's still some reluctancy to actually include that multidisciplinarity in the observations, and actually to include the indigenous people and the citizen on the process. So I would like to see that move forward.
Okay, chair's prerogative. I'm gonna have an opinion on this. So if I had a magic wand, I would form national fora, national convening of the various interests in a country and ocean, taking and using ocean information. So the major agencies and ministries to really do some joined-up thinking at a national level in terms of priorities, in terms of infrastructure needs, in terms of what the observation investments need to deliver to. So that would be my magic wand in the next 10 years, if anybody would like to help with that. So let's wrap up here, and thank you very much for your engagement, and let's thank our panelists. Thank you, and it's now time for lunch.